Well, the debate over whether vaccines usually don't work or aren't fully safe may never end, which at least explains why the contents are rarely publicized.
I'm fine. I'm just
But it's government recommended. Oh, well, that's my eye on the flu shot.
You would think that the FDA would take each of those ingredients and study them in human infants to make sure that each of those ingredients are safe. Well, they haven't done that. They've never taken vaccine quantities of each of those ingredients and done any sort of safety testing to confirm that each one of those ingredients are safe.
I'm a neuroscientist by training, and my studies are in the origin of neurological disease. I develop animal models of Parkinson's and Lou Gehrig's disease. Recently, we've been looking at aluminum, which is common to many vaccines. It's used as an adjuvant. That means helper. Without the aluminum, the vaccine basically does not provide any long-term protection. And so my research has looked at injectable aluminum and how it might impact the nervous system. The difference between injectable aluminum versus dietary aluminum is that aluminum that you eat is excreted fairly rapidly. Injectable aluminum, however, is meant to stick around. And that's precisely why it's there in the first place. That's what an adjuvant does. So we simply did the really simple experiment of taking the same stuff out of the vaccines, the aluminum hydroxide, and injecting it into mice, into the muscles, to see what would happen if we tried to mimic the vaccine schedule. We were quite surprised to see how rapidly the behavioral symptoms emerged. They showed not only behavioral deficits of motor function, but they ultimately showed cognitive deficits as well. And once we sacrificed the animals and started looking inside their brains and spinal cords, we found massive damage to motor neurons. And so we may be creating the conditions for Parkinson's disease, Lou Gehrig's disease, Alzheimer's disease. Maybe not immediately, but maybe 20, 30, 40 years down the road.
When I first saw her, she was having problems with seizures, intractable headaches, chest pains, and I found out that she began having problems following her Gardasil vaccinations. In my opinion, there's little room for doubt concerning that this condition was caused by the Gardasil. Every time she got another injection, she got worse and worse. I think Gardasil should be taken off the market. It hasn't been well tested before it was placed in the general public.
The FDA has a particular process that's called fast tracking when there is a promising drug that comes forward. Gardasil, they had scheduled a 4-year trial, but after 15 months, they went to the FDA and said, there is nothing like this vaccine on the market. Would you please consider this for fast track? And the FDA said yes. So within 6 months, they approved it. And as soon as they had it approved, Merck said, we will no longer continue our trial. We're going to stop our trial because our drug is now approved.
Is an example of why no vaccine, particularly a vaccine for children, should ever be fast-tracked by the FDA. Less than 1% of all cancer deaths are for cervical cancer. And yet we now have a vaccine that was only studied in 1,200 girls under the age of 16 before it was recommended for universal use by the CDC in all 11 and 12-year-old girls in this country. That's not science, that's politics.
Texas Governor Rick Perry has ordered that schoolgirls in his state must get the Gardasil shot. It's also worth pointing out that the AP says that Governor Perry has ties to Merck, including the fact that one of the company's lobbyists in the state of Texas is his former chief of staff.
We are standing publicly for the legal right to follow our conscience when making educated vaccine decisions for our families.
If the state can force you to put your life on the line or your child's life on the line for any medical intervention, then the state has too much power.
More than 2,000 Prince George's County students have not gotten their state-mandated shots. Tonight, an ultimatum to some of those parents: come to court, get the shots, or else.
More than 1,600 students and their parents have been ordered to appear in circuit court for the children to be immunized.
We can do this the easy way or we can do this the hard way, but it's going to have to get done.
I went over there and saw the parents lining up. They had police with dogs and guns patrolling the courthouse. I thought to myself, there is something wrong with this. We shouldn't be summoning parents under threat of imprisonment and fines because they didn't get their children a hepatitis B vaccination or a chickenpox vaccination. Americans are well aware that a number of prescription drugs that have been licensed as safe have been found to be unsafe after they're used by millions of people. And yet, when it comes to vaccines, which are mandated by law, there's somehow this separation made. The vaccines couldn't possibly be the same.
The majority of vaccine research is paid for by the vaccine manufacturers themselves. So the people who are approving the vaccines are taking the word of the pharmaceutical companies.
The pharmaceutical companies have been allowed to be too present at the table at the FDA and the CDC. And I think a firewall needs to be built between those in government who are regulating, making policy for, and developing vaccines, and those pharmaceutical companies that are making profit off the sale of vaccines.
You know, it's no wonder parents are asking questions. It's because doctors that are making these policies are financially benefiting from these policies. The ACIP is the organization that approves vaccine policy for the United States. You have some doctors on that board that have a direct financial interest in these vaccines. That's a huge conflict of interest.
Do you believe anybody who's getting funds from Merck or any of the other pharmaceutical companies should be on advisory panels that are making judgments about pharmaceuticals coming from those companies? Or do you believe that's a conflict of interest?
I think that's a difficult question to answer.
Wait a minute, let me get this straight. You think it's a difficult question to answer if somebody is getting funding of some type from a pharmaceutical company for them to sit on an advisory panel that's approving or giving their approval to a new drug that's coming on the market? You don't see that as a conflict?
It's important to point out that recommendations for vaccination are made independently by the American Academy of Pediatrics and the American Academy of Family Physicians. And those recommendations are virtually always in harmony with the recommendations from the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices.
The pharmaceutical industry is probably the most powerful lobbying force in Washington, D.C. There are